Welcome to Fear Street.
My name is Gabriel. I'm 20 years old now, and my encounter happened when I was 6, turning 7. Back then, my family and I lived in a country stead in Brazil. It wasn't a rural property, it was more like a country summer house, but in the city. The property was just outside the suburbs, in the northwestern part of the city, edging the city limits and nearing the country. It was an approximately 420 square meter piece of land, surrounded by 2 meter or 6.5 foot walls for more privacy. The house sat in a far corner of the property with a good view of the surroundings. The region resembles southern Missouri or northeastern Kansas, but it's tropical rather than temperate. The city is a metropolitan area with a population of over 486,000 people. It would resemble Wichita, Kansas, or Kansas City, Missouri. The landscape is fairly flat with some hills. The scenery has little vegetation, with only some parks and nature preserves. None big enough to have a decent population of any medium or large animal species whatsoever. There are no bears in Brazil, and the largest predators found in the wild are the wolf, cougar, and jaguar, none of which could be identified as what I saw. My encounter was brief, but it was clear enough for me to make out the shape of the creature. So, on to the encounter. It was Friday, October 18th, 2002. It was mid-spring, and that night there was a full moon, with relatively cloudy skies. We had a dozen dogs on the property, which all slept together in a large kennel on the side of the house. They'd be pretty quiet at night, but on this particular night, they were unsettled and spooked. One of the dogs managed to escape from the kennel and was desperately trying to get into the house. I was alone with my mom, and she asked me to turn on the floodlights outside the house and check out what all the commotion was about. I did that and went to the front porch to scan the area, trying to see what could have scared the dogs. Staring at the corner where there was a mango tree, about 90 to 120 meters away, I saw this large, grayish creature running on all fours, avoiding the lights. It passed behind the mango tree and disappeared into the dark. As soon as I saw it, I immediately identified it as being a werewolf, like that from the movie Bad Moon, but with a slightly larger head, thicker snout, and bulkier build. On its hind legs, it must have stood at the very least as tall as the property walls, which was 6.5 feet. I froze for a few seconds after seeing it, and as soon as I recovered from the shock, I sprinted as fast as I could back into the house. I locked all the doors and closed all the windows that were still open. I was familiar with werewolf movies back then, and I was already aware of the impossibility of there being someone who could shapeshift into a monster, but what I saw was unmistakably similar to a werewolf. So since that encounter, I started to believe in werewolves, which I now believe are really dogmen, a term I came across only recently. And that is the encounter I had with a dogman. Just like in the US, where there are places where sightings are frequent, there are places in Brazil where they happen frequently too. Juanopolis has had sightings of werewolves and dogmen ever since its foundation. Actually, its first mayor was said to be a werewolf, back in the mid to late 1800s. The town is filled with werewolf references. Três Lagos has had many sightings as well, ever since the late 1980s and early 1990s. There was a series of nights in this small city in the 90s where people claimed that a werewolf was roaming the streets at night after dark, trying to invade houses, climbing on roofs and howling all night long, scaring people's dogs, attacking livestock. It really scared people. The state police began reinforcing night patrols and started investigating, assuming that someone was out at night in a suit, scaring people. Some cryptozoologists even collected DNA samples. As it turned out, it wasn't human DNA or that of any known animal. Before I get started, Here's a little background info on me. I'm a 27-year-old guy who lives in the western part of Norway. I work and have a girlfriend. I'm 6'4", 230 pounds, fairly athletic, and not scared of much here in life. But on this night, I got incredibly scared. I haven't walked, camped, or done anything in the woods here since. I have been in the woods, but not in this particular part of the country. I've always loved the forest. It's so quiet. I love being alone, actually. If I have spare time, I always like to do things outside. Whether it be fishing, jogging, playing soccer, basketball, hiking, or whatever, really. Now, on to my encounter. The day was very normal. It was a Saturday afternoon. I had packed my tent and some food and was heading to the local mountain for a one-night camping trip. It wasn't a very difficult hike, but it was a very steep one. After 2 to 3 hours, even though I'm in respectable shape, I was pretty tired. I didn't have any mobile phone or clock with me, but my best guess is that the time was around 8 p.m. It's not that easy to guess the time, since the sun is up almost all day and all night when it's summertime here in Norway. It was a nice and clear evening. It was typical summer weather. I made a fire and cooked some food. I had a couple of hot dogs and a pack of marshmallows with me. After a couple of hours, I'd eaten my food. I felt a little sick because I had had probably 10 too many of the marshmallows. I had enjoyed my meal and was taking in the heat of the fire, thinking what a lovely evening it was. Eventually, it started to get somewhat dark. I'm going to say the time was probably around 11 p.m. I had planned to kick back and read, but it became a little too dark to do that. Sure, I could see and all, but it was a little too hard on my eyes to concentrate on the letters. I probably was a little too tired as well. Suddenly, I heard a noise from a bush to my right. I turned to look in that direction, and that's when I saw it, just standing there. It was standing to my right and kind of ahead of me. I've listened to reports, and they all say it's some big 7 to 9 foot monster of a beast. But this one really wasn't that big. I'd say it was 6 feet at the most. It didn't matter though. 6 feet or 9, I was still terrified. In one moment I was enjoying a nice evening by myself, and the next I was terrified. It was breathing heavy, like a very tired man, but it sounded animal-like, wild and weird. It sounded like it had throat problems, or slime in its throat or something. I really don't know how to describe it. I was still sitting at this point and just looked at it. I believe I was actually frozen in fear. I've never ever encountered anything other than a deer in the woods. The most dangerous animal we have in this area is probably a fox. The creature was frozen as well. It was standing on 2 legs with its arms down at its sides. I can't say how many seconds we both stayed like this. Of course, it felt like forever, an eternity. I couldn't see its eyes because they were dark and kind of in the shadow of its brow or sockets, but its head was fixed on me. That I could tell. I was just sitting there, unable to take my eyes off of it. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was afraid of making the first move. You know how a cat slowly moves its paws ahead when it thinks it's safe, or when it thinks its prey isn't paying attention? Well, to me, that's what it seemed like it started doing. My first instinct was to throw a handful of red glowing sticks from the fire at it. When I did that, it bolted. As I said, I haven't been back in the woods since, but I know I'll never forget that encounter. I'm 32 years old, from the very northern tip of West Virginia. Most of my life has been lived in Hancock County. When I was little, we camped in tents. We walked everywhere, hiked at parks, all that outside goodness. In my teens, we started going to state parks to ride horses. I've been to Tomlinson Run, Beaver Creek State Park, Salt Fork, Raccoon Creek, and Vista Park. We had a friend who was constantly inviting us to ride on people's land that she had received permission from. I'm well acquainted with the local wildlife. I've seen all the major players, including coyotes and bears, and can identify most sounds in the forest. I love watching nature documentaries. I was looking to become a vet, so I studied a lot on animals. Drawing and painting them got me very acquainted with animal anatomy. Was I ever into cryptozoology? Yes. I was dino crazy. My one babysitter had Reader's Digest, Mysteries of the Unexplained. The thought of a plesiosaur in Scotland or an apatosaurus in the Congo was just mind-blowing. Later in life, I started looking at it like folklore. It was interesting to read the accounts and learn the theories behind what people were seeing, but I believed in them as much as a folklorist believes in dragons and trolls. I didn't have any interest in Bigfoot, and I'd never heard of Dogman. I never had an interest in looking, nor did the thought ever cross my mind. It seems I didn't need to go looking. They found me. We moved to a farm when I was about 10. Mom's dream was to have horses, and she was finally able to live it. The farmhouse was haunted, mainly by the former residents of the house. I never felt threatened by them, though. It's a little unnerving to have two men talking and moving the couch you're sitting on. Or should I say, it sounded like it. No one was home, no media was on, and yet I was hearing two men talking about how they were going to move the couch, and where, and the sound of furniture being dragged right from under me. The land itself had its share of strangeness. Most things were benign, though. We just shrugged and carried on. I honestly hated our woods. Anywhere else I'd freely hike, but even in the yard, sometimes I felt watched. Heck, sometimes I thought something was staring in our windows. Now that I think of it, we did have things slam into our trailer. I'd think it was a horse that had gotten loose, but when I'd go out to investigate, I'd find nothing. So I'd chalk it up to a deer. I use my horses' breeds for their names, rather than think up names for them. Anyone who knows me knew my horses' names. I was 18 to 19 when this encounter took place. By this time we had given up on cows, and just had the horses and chickens. Someone knocked on the door at 2 a.m. I'd only been asleep 2 hours, but years of conditioning had my heart pumping and my mind racing. Someone knocking that early meant trouble. It usually meant horses or livestock had gotten out. I wasn't disappointed. Our neighbor said the horses were in his yard. My mind wasn't totally awake, so I didn't think to ask which yard they were in. My stepfather came out, asked what was up, and told me they were my horses, so deal with it. Mom was working. That was nothing new. This lot of horses had 3 expert escape artists. I had the routine down. It was pretty dark out, but I did have some moonlight to help. The security light only went so far. Then, of course, it shut off after so long. When it was cloudy, you literally had to watch that you didn't walk off into the ravine. It was so pitch dark. I was naturally in a foul mood, cursing my horses and wondering if some drunk had gone through the fence again. It happened a lot. As I got closer to the brown barn, I realized a horse was flipping out. It was running back and forth, squealing and carrying on. I went in and grabbed the halters and leads. Then I paused for a moment to see if any other horse or horses had replied to the horse I heard squeal. That would give me an idea where the other horse or horses might be. But there was no reply. That was odd. I was thinking, crap, they're on the other side of the hill. It was the only reason in my mind they wouldn't be replying. Let's just say, when they followed our cut trails to the other side, it took us an hour to traverse through the woods and lead them back. And even with 2 guys on a 4-wheeler and my mom, that was a freaky trek. I felt like I was being watched and followed. Maybe it wasn't paranoia. So the land is set up like this. The brown barn was connected to a small pasture, about half an acre long, which then connects to a 7-acre pasture. Pretty much in the center, on the outside edge of the large pasture, was an old white barn, that we turned into a run-in. I decided to tackle the horse still in the fence so I could bring her down to the small pasture to keep her from escaping too. Maybe the others would follow. I had to walk clear to the other side of the pasture to get to the panicking horse. It was my mother's psycho Appaloosa mare. I tried to catch her and nearly got trampled a few times. She was frothing at the mouth, and the whites of her eyes were really showing. Was I alarmed? No. As I said, she's psycho. I noticed my other 6 were across the road. They were standing in a tiny little fenced-in area under a spotlight. They were completely motionless and not touching a blade of grass. I was wondering how the neighbor managed to herd them into that tiny fenced-in area with that tiny door. 3 of those horses were over 16 hands tall. 1 was a draft horse cross. The doorway was actually small enough. He touched both sides going through. My thoroughbred mare took me 2 hours to corral the last time she got out. So a stranger rounding them up and putting them into a tiny yard was mind-blowing. I've had horses since I was 9. I'm 32 now. I've also had ponies. I've had Appaloosas, Arabians, draft horses, quarter horses, walking horses, saddlebreds, thoroughbreds, Mustangs, fowls, geldings, mares, and geldings that still thought they were stallions. I've had a lot of horses from all walks of life. I'll tell you, they consistently don't like to be crammed into tight spaces, especially not in a group. I had 2 severely abused horses that I was rehabbing, a thoroughbred that actually had PTSD, and a racking horse that took me 3 years to touch without some sort of bad reaction. They didn't like being in stalls, and all but 1 were mares. Mares are extremely moody, and 2 of mine were particularly vicious to those they didn't like. My walker mare only liked 3 other horses. She should have been kicking the crap out of the others there. They also didn't like to be under lights when they escaped. They avoided them like the plague. And not eating grass that was over ankle deep, that was unheard of. They were silent and dead still. My neighbor came out and told me that they weren't like that when he found them. He asked me if I needed help, but I said no. My thoroughbred and racking horse mares didn't like men. I told him I'd take them out, one at a time. I took 1 halter and lead and threw the rest outside the gate. I put the halter on my gelding and opened the gate to lead him out. They had other plans, though. All 6 came out, as a freaking unit. They were literally chest to butt, crammed together. My gelding and my Welsh mare had their chests pushing against me as we walked back to the brown barn. Normally, they didn't do this. I wouldn't usually allow such bad behavior. We were on the main road, which I didn't like. The speed limit is only 35, but people go 60. So I tried to lead them through the large pasture gate. They wouldn't even go to that side of the road, though. I was a little unnerved by their behavior, so I led them down to the brown barn, and they went in. They were skittish, though, picking at the hay I threw out, walking around restlessly, sticking to the barn like glue, and eyeing the upper pasture. I rationalized it by thinking, it's the Appy flipping out that's unnerving them. And why hadn't she come down yet? She had to have seen us all walk down. I rushed to the gate, between the little and big pastures out of habit. I didn't want the herd to go back out into the big pasture, but I didn't have to worry. They didn't follow me like they usually did. The gate was wide open, but the Appy was still running and squealing back and forth in the same area. I started to go get her. Now, the neighbor's security lights didn't really light up my pasture. The road was higher than my pasture, so it was cast in a shadow. I could make out her shape in some detail, though. She took off at a panicked gallop, swerved sideways, and jumped the stream. When she landed, she nearly landed on her face. She caught herself, though, and took off at a dead gallop again. I ducked behind a stump. If she would have hit me, I would have been dead. I went back and chained the gate. I decided to forego looking her over until I got the halters and leads. She was too hot at the moment. I decided to walk on the road instead of through the pasture again. The pasture was uneven, unlit, and full of springs. Sometime during this, clouds had taken over the sky. so there was no moonlight to see by. The spot on the road where I was at was paved and pretty well lit though. I had almost gotten to the white barn when I got this sudden urge to stop and look at a very specific spot in the pasture. I'd like to say it was instinct that told me to look, but usually I'd scan the woods first to see what was watching me. That's usually where the watchers are. Instead, I just flicked on my flashlight right on a certain spot. It was extremely close to where the mare was flipping out. I saw a red eye shine. My first thought was, why in the world would a deer be there with all that chaos? I was feeling a sense of extreme dread and didn't know why. Besides, with it being where my horse was going nuts, it told me something else just wasn't right. I then realized where the eyes were, relative to the walnut trees and my racing barrels. See, the road is above the pasture, and the walnut trees were right at the same elevation as the road. The pasture itself is sloped to deal with the runoff from the road. The barrel it was next to was on the low end of the incline. The barrels were white, so I could see a dim lighting on the one it was next to. This thing was way too big to be a deer. I was frozen, standing there watching it. I just had this feeling that it was evil, and that I had to keep track of those eyes. It was watching me. It slowly blinked a few times. It also looked over into the woods above the pasture. The thought that there may be more of them out there crossed my mind, so I shined my flashlight over the woods to see if I'd catch any other eye shine. I didn't see any though, so I went right back to the eyes. They were still there. I flicked back and forth, making sure nothing was sneaking up on me. I don't know how long I stood there, watching, frozen. Someone could have come around the bend and hit me with their car. I was so focused. Finally, it started to move off. It glanced at me sideways a few times. I think it went into the trees after that, around the creek. I heard nothing. That wasn't surprising though. The horses were still restless and making noises. I stood there a long time after, looking for eye shine. I was wondering if it could have been a bear. I didn't think so though. The eyes were consistent in height until it disappeared. Bears are clumsy on their back legs. On this uneven inclined ground, I have no doubt a bear would have dropped to the ground to go on all fours. Even the rear up and drop down behavior bears do when they're trying to see something wouldn't work. We had one cross our pasture before. He made a lot of noise going through the woods. The horses settled down quicker with the bear. I was almost to my neighbors at this point. I considered leaving the couple $100 of tack at his house. I had no doubt if I left them there, they'd be gone in the morning. My mother would be pissed. So I darted over, grabbed them, and ran like a bat out of hell. I know. I should have left the tack. I also know you're not supposed to run, but I couldn't even conceive what I had just seen. I got into the barn, threw the tack down, and hung with the horses. I wasn't going to go back up that pitch-black driveway on foot. I figured with the horses I'd have a warning, and the barn had plenty of sharp things. I didn't go back up until dawn. I was frozen stiff by that time. I've had years to think this over, and it unnerves the crap out of me. How long was that thing there? Was that what was keeping the Appy mare from coming down? Was it right there in the shadows while I was trying to catch her? Or was it in the unlit barn that I had walked through to get to the road? Was it the reason the Appy swerved and nearly fell? How did my horses get out? I never did find out how they got out. Did they panic and jump the fence? I checked the fence line away from the woods. I also looked for tracks around the barrel, but sadly the ground was hard from frost that morning. But I will say, the Appy mare was running around for a good while. The ground was severely torn up and turned into a muddy mess. I'll bet it was her that woke the neighbor up. It took the horses about a week to fully settle down. I don't know if whatever it was still in the area, or if they were just that traumatized.